suočavanje s istinom, Komisije za istinu, koja će nam nešto reći o iskustvima u drugim zemljama sličnih komisija. I prije nego što krene, samo da pozdravim, dobili smo još 2 sudionika, to je Gordan Bosanac i Drago Pilsel. Dobrodošli.
A s nama je i kolegica s Haltera, Jelena Svivčić. Evo, ja ih sve prvo pozdravljam isto.
Nasilje južnoafričkog apartheida je okončano, ali će nasljeđe rasnog konflikta biti pamćeno generacijama. 1993. godine lider oslobodilačkog pokreta i predsjednik apartheida dijele Nobelovu nagradu za mir. Bivši neprijatelji su pregovorima doveli do mirnog kraja apartheida. Nakon što je donijela novi ustav, Južna Afrika drži svoje prve demokratske izbore. Južnoafrički glasači biraju nove vođe u periodu mirne tranzicije. Gotovo nezamisliv pomak u odnosu na prošlost. Ali proslave ne mogu izbrisati sjećanja vezana za ugnjetavanje i stradanja pod apartheidom. Policijska brutalnost i represija su završene. Ali Južna Afrika ostaje jedno od najnejednakijih društava na svijetu. Za ispravljanje nepravde iz prošlosti treba će puno više donošenja novog ustava.
Južna Afrika je od jednog nasilničkog ugnjetačkog režima postala gotovo preko noći nova demokratija. I sa tom krhkom demokratijom je trebalo postupati vrlo pažljivo. Bila je pod velikim rizikom.
Južna Afrika nije oslobođena oružjem ljudima koji su marširali, oslobodilačkom vojskom koja je marširala ulicama i preuzela vladu i onda su iz toga proistekla suđenja u Nürnberškom stilu. Ne, to nije izgledalo tako. Desio se kompromis, pregovor. I dio cijelog tog paketa je bio proces istine i pomirenja. Ne kažem da je izabran savršen put, ali to je bio pokušaj da se kaže: hajde da budemo jedna ujedinjena nacija i da se pomirimo. To je ono što želimo da uradimo.
At Bishop's Court in Cape Town, 16 of the country's 17 newly appointed truth commissioners began their work under the chairmanship of Archbishop Desmond Tutu.
Komisija za istinu i pomirenje, uspostavljena novim ustavom, prvi put se sastaje u decembru 1995. U komisiji su borci za ljudska prava, svećenici, sudije, pravnici, psiholozi. Komisija, poznata pod nazivom TRC, oblikovana je tokom 2 godine debata na temeljima informacija dobivenih o komisijama za istinu u Latinskoj Americi.
Na relaciji jug-jug je razmijenjena nevjerovatna količina informacija. Čile je učio iz onog što su ili što nisu radili u Urugvaju i Argentini. Prije nego se desila tranzicija u Čileu, Južnoafrikanci su učili od Čila i Argentine. Onda su Peruanci učili od Južnoafrikanaca. Tako da postoje različiti modeli. Opšti principi se mogu naučiti ili saznati, ali ne i specifično rješenje.
I dok TRC otvara urede u većim gradovima i putuje lokalna susjedstva, žrtve i svjedoci počinju otvoreno govoriti o onome što im se desilo. Svjedočenja 21.000 žrtava postaće dio oficijelnog zapisa. Najreprezentativniji slučajevi čuti će se na javnim saslušanjima. TRC ima na raspolaganju 18 mjeseci da uspostavi sveobuhvatnu sliku velikih kršenja ljudskih prava tokom apartheida, da da priliku žrtvama da ih se čuje, da predloži odštete, kao i mjere za sprječavanje budućih kršenja.
Your Grace, Chairperson of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I report that the office of the Commission in the region of the Eastern Cape.
Bilo je jako teško na početku. Imali smo 17 osoba iz različitih dijelova zemlje. Ljudi koji nikada nisu radili zajedno.
Bila je to Južna Afrika u malom. Bilo je tu Afrikanera, Jevreja, muslimana. Bilo je tu Hindusa, bilo je žena, bilo je muškaraca.
Bilo je momenata, a ponekad i dana, kada se uopšte nismo slagali.
Bio je to pakao. Da, početak je bio pakao.
Uspostavljanjem odnosa sa crnom većinom i ohrabrivanjem žrtava da otvoreno govore, Komisija za istinu čini nemogućim negiranje užasa i nepravdi apartheida. Neki će istinu teško prihvatiti.
Za vrijeme apartheida, a mislim velikim dijelom i danas, većina bijelih Južnoafrikanaca je držana u mraku od strane vlade apartheida u vezi toga što se desilo. To je išlo do te mjere da su se navikli da imaju poveze na očima i nisu ni željeli znati šta se u stvari događa.
I want to ask you a question, but if it is too painful for you to answer, that's fine. You have told us today that you were tortured. If you are able to, and it's not too painful, could you describe some of that torture? What actually did they do to you? Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you very much. That adjourns the proceedings for today. We will start tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Thank you very much indeed.
For someone like the Archbishop, za nekog kao što je nadbiskup, on u stvari svaki svoj dan u komisiji razmišlja o tome kako će ovaj proces voditi izmirenju. I mislim da je ono za što se borite vrsta društvenog konteksta u kojem će ljudi koji ne vjeruju jedni drugima naći načina da bi živjeli zajedno. Da li će oni ikada razumjeti jedni druge je pitanje kojim se ne bavite unutar jedne generacije. To je nešto što treba da se desi među generacijama.
I'm not going to ask you to go over what happened because I think it's very, very painful for you. But you've come to the Commission to tell your story, and we'd like to hear from you about what you want the Commission to do for you.
If I can find an answer to this question, how do you go about forgiving this person who is a cruel murderer? Who killed a defenseless person?
We kill ourselves.
Mi se zavaravamo ako kažemo što se desilo. Desilo se, prošlost ostaje. I izuzev ako ste uradili ono što smo mi mislili da smo uradili, pogledali zvijeri u oči, ta zvijer će se sigurno vratiti da vas progoni.
Mrs. Godorosi, you are here to testify and to give evidence about the disappearance of your husband, Kakauli Godorosi.
Južnoafrička javna saslušanja emituju se u cijelom svijetu s takvim utjecajem da je većina kasnijih komisija za istinu usvojila tu praksu.
Did you ever manage to find out where your husband is or what happened to your husband?
Not any commission
present the information that we got from the people who were also in the cells.
Postojala je želja da se dođe do istine, da bi se saznalo šta se tačno desilo u pojedinim situacijama. Zato što je bilo mnogo stvari koje se desilo, a ljudi nisu bili zadovoljni jer nisu znali šta se zaista desilo. To je bilo ono što je bilo kritično. Saznati šta se desilo. Recite nam.
Ono što se desilo u Post-Chalmersu je ostalo tajna punih 12 godina. Troje aktivista je bilo kidnapovano, dovedeno ovdje, mučeno i ubijeno. Rodbina žrtava saznaje istinu od strane jednog počinioca zločina koji se složio da se ispriča u zamjenu za pomilovanje. Gideon Nivod je bivši detektivski narednik.
Kaptein van Seileek van Niawashe is dat in 2-2 geweer geskiet. Hy het die geweer aan my oorhandig, waar ek op my beurt van meneer Boedelosi geskiet het. En meneer Lots het van meneer Galela geskiet. Ons het al drie die oorlewedes op die houtstapel geplaas. Ek het die vuur aan die brand gesteek hier.
Dobro se sjećam, na početku naših saslušanja, kad su žrtve dolazile da ispričaju svoje priče, bio je izvjestan broj ljudi u ovoj zemlji koji su govorili, to su sve pretjerivanja, a to nije ni blizu istine. Sve dok nismo počeli saslušavati počinioce zločina koji su tražili pomilovanje i potvrđivali da su oni u stvari uradili sve te stvari.
Ek het opdracht van vanzelf gekry om dit te vernietig, wat ek gedoen het. Ek het dit na die visrivier toegeneem, voor Kraddock, voor die Kraddock.
Nivod je jedan od 7000 bivših bezbednosnih i vladinih službenika koji traže pomilovanje, koje će biti dato jedino za zločine koji su bili politički motivirani i pod uslovom da je njihovo svjedočenje bilo istinito i kompletno.
Ono što se dešavalo je da su ljudi govorili da mi puštamo te zločince da izmaknu. A šta je sa pravdom? Ovoj komisiji je pravda bitna. Ali to nije retributivna pravda. To je restorativna pravda.
In those other occasions, did you ever assault him or had to assault him?
Nije.
Why was it the case this time?
Zločinci traže pomilovanje jer je prijetnja da će biti sudski gonjeni stvarna. Komisija za istinu nije zamjena za sudove. Suđenja za zločine počinjene tokom apartheida dešavaju se uporedo s radom komisije. Ako pomilovanje nije dato, sudsko gonjenje može uslijediti.
Mr. Jack will say that he was assaulted on other occasions, and that involved you.
Bez obzira da li je lagao ili ne, nije se radilo o njemu. Proces koji provodi TRC je namijenjen nacionalnom pomirenju i jedinstvu. On tu nije ključan. Južnoj Africi je trebalo da se pomiri i ujedini, uprkos Nivoltu i onome što je on rekao. Ali lažući vi sipate so na ran, jer zašto onda pristajete da govorite i tražite pomilovanje, a onda ipak lažete?
Komitet za pomilovanje je otkrio da Gideon Nivod nije svjedočio iskreno i u potpunosti. Njegova molba za pomilovanje je odbijena. Program pomilovanja je ostao kontraverzan i bio široko kritiziran. Samo 12% aplikanata je dobilo pomilovanje, a niti jedna druga komisija za istinu prije ili poslije nije ponudila program pomilovanja.
Problem sa primjerom Južnoafričke komisije je taj da oni koji su odlučili da rizikuju i ne svjedoče nisu bili sudski gonjeni. tako da je to djelomično uprljan model za buduću referencu. Jer neki ljudi mogu kalkulisati, možda ako rizikuješ malo duže sačekaš, prođeš najbolje, ne osramotiš se, a i ne završiš u zatvorskoj ćeliji. Mislim da je to bio neuspjeh komisije, ali pored toga, Komisija za istinu je u Južnoj Africi dala ključni poticaj u uspostavljanju temelja novog života zemlje. Ideje o istini, etičkih pitanja i brige za prava i dostojanstvo ljudi koji su dugi niz godina bili ponižavani, isključeni i progonjeni.
TRC razumije da je dokumentarno bilježenje pojedinačnih zločina samo prvi korak. Oni traže obrazce vršenja zločina, manje dramatične, ali sve obuhvatnije zločine od kojih je stradalo cjelokupno stanovništvo.
Administrativni akti, zakoni koji je donio kabinet aktivnosti Državnog savjeta bezbjednosti, ovo su na izvjestan način bile stvarne aktivnosti apartheida koji su uništile ne samo selektiranu grupu preživjelih, nego i svakog crnog južnoafrikanca. Mislim da je postojao rizik da Komisija za istinu, obzirom da se fokusirala na ovo usko polje prijestupa, na izvjestan način ne uspije da prepozna široko rasprostranjeno zlo u društvu, način na koji su rasa, klasa, spol, bili samo objašnjiva sredstva u razumijevanju obrazaca nasilja i prekršaja pod apartheidom.
We were aware of what these violations were. What we're attempting to say here is that we didn't give
Seriju saslušanja proučavaju se aktivnosti i neuspjeh da se bilo šta poduzme od strane pravnih i medicinskih profesija, privrednog sektora, medija, religioznih zajednica i drugih, cijelog društvenog sistema koji je apartheid učinio mogućim.
You were the prosecuting authority. Did it not strike you as odd that over this period of time, so many people were dying in detention in mysterious circumstances, and the police were consistently saying it had nothing to do with us?
Our hands were chopped off. If a witness prefers to lie, and that lie is not broken, then those are the facts.
Everybody who was involved in the legal profession, the judiciary, magistrates, attorneys, advocates, and academics, were all complicit.
The only thing we need to do is to just treat the patient. Even if we see people being tortured, we must just keep quiet. This was the instruction for the hospital management.
World Medical Association quotes that the supreme guide of the doctor is his conscience. How many of us have been true to our conscience?
Mi smo prekinuli da ne bi bilo predugo i mislim da je dosta od nas već imalo i ranije nekih informacija o radu upravo ove komisije i da je ovo dobar uvod zapravo na našeg dragog i cijenjenog gosta. Zamolimo da sada iz vlastitog iskustva, ja osobno bih voljela da s nama podijelite i na koji način ste osobno bili, biskupe Dowling, uključeni u ovaj proces i koja su to pitanja, poteškoće, koja su to postignuća koja vas i danas drže vezanim uz taj mogući model i koji vas motiviraju da svoje iskustvo podijelite sa nama i sa drugim dijelovima i u drugim zemljama gdje bi takav jedan model mogao koristiti.
It's the only word I know so far. Good afternoon, everyone. And I would firstly like to sincerely thank Katerina and everyone involved in RECOM and all of you who are participating in this vitally important process here in the former Yugoslavia. I'd like to sincerely thank you for inviting me. This is a wonderful privilege and gift to be with you. And already listening to what has been said here has brought me back to my own experience of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and my own experience of the suffering that you saw on that film. Also, I'd like to sincerely thank our translators, interpreters at the back who are doing such an excellent job, and I just want to express my appreciation to you. It's very clear that a so-called Truth Commission, whatever name we give it, has to be very specific, and it has to respond to the actual reality of either a war or of gross human rights violations, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and it has to focus on, in a very special way, the issues of transitional justice and the rights of the victims, and how you try to balance retributive justice, as Archbishop Tutu spoke of, that is, where perpetrators are punished for their crimes, and restorative justice, where you try to develop a system, a response to the reality which tries to strive for a justice that enables a nation or a society to come to terms with its past, to begin to live together, even taking as the absolute bottom line that the society and the people decide that we start with the simple commitment that we will not kill each other anymore, and from there move forward to try and create a new society. A restorative justice that brings people together around a common vision that whatever has happened, for the sake of our children and the very possibility of a future, we have got to come to terms with our past and make sure that never again what happened will happen again, and that if we can develop the resources that we all have as people and recognize the uniqueness and gift that each of us is, we can make something very different in the future. And just to show the difficulty of this, the practical difficulty of this, I'm involved also in the post-Truth Commission process in Sierra Leone, one of the most brutal and barbaric civil wars that occurred in a single country, where it wasn't an inter-regional conflict, a regional conflict like occurred here in the former Yugoslavia, but people from the same nation killing each other in the most brutal fashion. Children, babies, young people, adults who had one arm, two arms, one leg, two legs cut off, rape as a war crime, a civil war crime, and so on. And just to show you the issue of justice, how complicated this is, the 9 perpetrators, leading perpetrators of that incredible violence, 85,000 people killed and 29,000 victims mutilated, only 9 of the leaders were indicted at criminal courts, including Charles Taylor from Liberia, who was transferred to the International Criminal Court. Those 9 trials cost $300 million US. And yet, for thousands of victims, only $3 million has been put aside for them. There are huge issues in this, and I want to certainly commend all of you at RECOM and in the civil society process here for what you have already done, for the professionalism of what you are doing, for your very realistic approach to these issues, but also for the passion that I sense in all of you, that no matter what the difficulties are, there is a vision of where you want to go, and I commend you for this, and I support you totally in this, and I hope in some way, now and in the future, to be part of this. The Truth Commission in South Africa is something you can learn from, just as we learn from others. The Truth Commission in South Africa was very unique in this sense, that the colonial history of South Africa meant that it was not just a black population that was oppressed, but that we also had a white indigenous population that had a long history, that had been there for over 300 years, that were part of the country whom nobody else wanted. For better or for worse, the white race, of which I am one of them, born in South Africa, they had a history, they belonged. They had to be taken account of. They couldn't just be said, go back to your countries of origin and leave the indigenous black population to create its own future. And so, as you saw in the film, Nelson Mandela and the then President Frederick de Klerk came together eventually after an enormous civil society uprising against the apartheid regime, which lasted years and years with unspeakable brutalities, disappearances, murder, judicial execution, and so on. Eventually, the government, the regime at the time recognized that this could not be sustained, also with the international pressure, sanctions, and the fact that South Africa had been condemned everywhere as the pariah of the world. And they came together eventually and started a process of consultation involving all political formations and civil society on the outside, looking in and participating where we could. What set up, or what occasioned the Truth Commission, was that right at the end of this negotiating process for a new country, President de Klerk said, I will not sign an agreement unless you give amnesty for the apartheid forces, security forces. In other words, the thousands of security police and army who were guilty of the atrocities against the population, unless you give them amnesty. Now, Mandela and his people thought about this and then said, for the sake of a future country, we agree. Therefore, when the new government was elected, the Minister of Justice was given the responsibility of creating a new law to give amnesty to the perpetrators on certain conditions. That was when civil society came in a very big way. Churches, human rights groups, victims groups, the victims themselves, lawyers for human rights, and so on. All civil society factions came in and protested. And eventually, we were heard. Protested that we cannot have a law which just is going to deal with the perpetrators and possible amnesty for them and take no account of the victims. That is so totally unjust. It is totally unacceptable. Huge pressure was put on the government, and the government acceded. And it was out of that that the Truth Commission was eventually set up in view of national reconciliation. That was the goal, national reconciliation. So firstly, our Truth Commission came out of a political compromise, and that has to be underlined. And in a political compromise, you are going to have give and take, and you are going to have to face the fact that in the end, for peace, for the possibility of beginning again, probably you are going to have to sacrifice justice. And that is the story of the rest of Africa as well. That if you are going to try to, first of all, create peace, stop a war, stop violence, and then try to sustain that peace, try to rebuild a country in many cases, in some way or other, to a greater or lesser extent, you are going to have to sacrifice justice. And that is what happened in South Africa. The Truth Commission, as it was set up in law, as you saw in the film, had 17 commissioners. They were divided, they came, all of them, and that was another pressure from civil society. No politicians, all of them had to be respected people from civil society and different formations in civil society. As you saw, lawyers, civil society activists, different religions, church people, and so on. People that civil society was able to say to government, yes, these are the people we trust, and a short list was made and 17 were chosen. They were divided into 3 committees. Firstly, the Truth Committee, establishing the truth. And as has already been said, what we were doing there was much what you are talking about here, establishing the facts about what happened. That was, I would say, the great success of our Truth Commission. It involved the whole of civil society, churches and so on. We set up victim support groups all over the country. Churches were involved in this as well, all the churches, human rights activists and so on. Victims were able to come forward, even if they were illiterate. You had all these structures working with them. Their stories were taken down, written down, corroborated, supported, sent to the Truth Committee. They were, every single one of these were documented forever in the hope that never will this happen again. Out of these, the Truth Committee chose certain incidents or certain people to come to the public hearings. And this is where the South African society, and especially the white society, who had been kept apart from this reality all through the apartheid regime, saw on television and radio every single day these appalling stories of atrocities, of dreadful abuse, of people disappearing. And here the cultural dimension again is so important. In our African culture, it is so important that people who have lost someone, who have someone, a family member who dies, that they're able to take that body and reverently bury that body with all their rituals. Otherwise, there is absolutely no closure. They are forever disturbed as people. And thousands of these loved ones have disappeared. And so the compromise here was that the Amnesty Committee would offer to the perpetrators in the security forces the opportunity to come forward and tell their stories of the atrocities they have done. This in the hope that some of the truth or the facts that were unknown about people who had disappeared, or the facts about how people were murdered and tortured, would come forward in that process. But the telling of the story was a tremendous moment of facing reality, the facts, for the South African population, and especially the whites. I testified. I was involved as a bishop in a peace march in the village where I live in 1991, and the Homeland Security Forces opened fire on us with live ammunition and steel tear gas projectiles. The command went out from the commander on the top of one of these vehicles, these armored vehicles, shoot the baruti, which means shoot the priests. And they opened fire on us, we who were leading the 6,000 people in a peace march. I was ducking and weaving as I saw these projectiles flying at me, but then I suddenly heard live ammunition being shot. And a student near me and another student were hit by bullets. One was killed instantly, the other severely injured. Their bodies thrown over the fence. Everybody went running. The soldiers went mad, beating up old women. I wrote the story of that unknown young student to the Truth Committee. I told his story. I found the family, I wrote the story, I named him. And because I was a church leader, I was called to the Truth Commission hearings in that town. And I will never forget that whatever suffering I went through then and afterwards was as nothing compared to women who years before had been systematically raped by the security police in the cells simply because they belonged to the African National Congress, a liberation movement. And there they were, as you saw, breaking down in tears for something that had happened 10, 12 years, 15 years before, and still it was there. They were not healed. And the challenge then was, they testified, what were we going to do as a government and as a civil society so that these people could be healed and begin again? And so the issue of the third committee in the Truth Commission came forward. Reparations. Reparations to the victims. And how do you decide on the different categories of victims, something you've already referred to in terms of Croatia here and what you're doing in the former Yugoslavia. So the stories, the hearings of the Truth Committee was a tremendous success in that sense of bringing to the South African nation the horrors of our past, the facts. They could not be denied. The amnesty process, which I want to just briefly deal with now, and then the reparations to conclude. The amnesty process was perhaps the most controversial and difficult. This was basically a judicial process. There were two judges, two of our High Court judges, who sat at the amnesty hearings. A perpetrator could have lawyers, advocates to advise and direct his testimony. Victims could cross-examine the perpetrator with lawyers and so on. And again, civil society was there to support, pay for the victims and their legal representatives. When this amnesty committee was set up, we had a lot of input from civil society into the issues of what would the amnesty committee demand of the perpetrator. What in the end was agreed to, which we absolutely opposed, was that all the perpetrator had to do was, in the opinion of the committee, tell the truth or tell the facts about what he, it was mostly he, had done. In cross-examination, it could be determined then, as far as possible, whether he was telling the truth. He also had to prove that the atrocities he committed was in view of a political end. In other words, he was supporting the apartheid regime, the political regime in power. His actions were in support of this regime. He had to, they had to in some way recognize that the atrocity he committed in some way kept that regime in power. And if all that was established, he could be, in the view of the judges, given amnesty. What we objected to very strongly from civil society and from church was this, that if the Truth Commission was in view of national reconciliation, then a fundamental part of being forgiven, amnesty, if you look at it in that theological way, of being forgiven for your crime, is that you should ask pardon. You should ask forgiveness and beg forgiveness from your victims. We're sitting there listening to the terrible things you had done against our loved ones. Ask forgiveness and make some form of personal restitution. Otherwise, in our view, theologically, spiritually, and humanly, surely this perpetrator, who hadn't committed small things, but murder, torture, burning bodies, taking bodies and throwing them in a river for the crocodiles to eat so that there'd be no trace. How could you be given amnesty if you did not in some way reach out to your victim, your victim's survivors, parents, family, seek forgiveness, and then do something to make restitution, make some sacrifice that their lives could be in some way touched and helped? They did not have to do this. A few of those perpetrators actually did try and ask forgiveness of the families. But they could literally speak and tell exactly what had happened. The facts prove they'd done this in support of the apartheid regime, their superiors, their officers, the government, the State Security Committee, and so on. And then they would be given amnesty. This was a profound injustice in the eyes of the victims. They, most of them, the vast majority of them, were very poor people. In many cases, they had lost a husband, a father, who was the breadwinner. They were living in abject poverty. And they saw this man, who was living at least a middle-class style of life, who had a job, he could walk out, never to be prosecuted again, never able to have a civil claim brought against him by the victims because he'd been granted amnesty. They had to go back to their shacks and struggle. So that, in our view, was where the Truth Commission failed. It failed to give justice to the victims because this was a political compromise. And on top of this, where our Truth Commission failed again was the third committee, the Reparations Committee. When the Truth Commission as a whole published the volumes of evidence that they gathered and the stories, they also dealt with atrocities committed by the African National Congress in exile, in the camps in other countries, because there were atrocities. And therefore, because they put these atrocities with the atrocities committed by the apartheid regime, the ANC government at the time were outraged that there could be even the impression given that there was some kind of similarity between a liberation force fighting for freedom and justice and this appalling apartheid regime. And a lot of the politicians of the time, because this was some years into our new democracy and we were trying to get on with building a new country, they kind of lost interest or passion for the long term working with the Truth Commission. This was compounded by the fact that the committee, the Reparations Committee, decided in the end that they would recommend a lot of reparations, but in the end the South African government simply paid out every single victim, including the victim that I testified for, 30,000 rand. That would be about 3,000 euros. Nothing else. And he died there. That was the end of it. Those victims are still where they are. I was also, with a black bishop, called, as you saw, to the commission to testify about the role of the churches in the struggle against apartheid. We specifically, we asked forgiveness for our failures as church, and we talked all about that. But we said we've got to look at the beneficiaries of the apartheid regime to see how they can be part of the process of national reconciliation by responding to the victims. And we targeted firstly the business community, the big corporations who paid slave labor wages to the workers in the mines and so on. We said these benefited right through the apartheid times from this appalling regime. They must contribute to the restoration, restorative justice, restoring the nation. And we suggested to the government that they should impose on all the big corporations a one-off solidarity tax for 1 year that would bring in hundreds of millions of South African rands, of dollars even, hundreds of millions, which could be put in a development fund to aid the victims of apartheid, to develop areas of great poverty, to ensure that the victims' families went to good schools, got a good education, got jobs and skills, proper health care, and so on. Much like is happening now in Sierra Leone. This very month, the Reparations Committee is beginning to look at all those issues in a much better way than we did. The government did not take our suggestion. The business community was no way taxed whatsoever. But at the moment, what we are doing, civil society and the churches, we are taking the case of the victims to the other countries, particularly in America, where the big companies that supported the apartheid regime are now being challenged in court to pay reparations to the victims, like the companies that supplied armored vehicles or components to the South African army, which oppressed the poor and the suffering and the justice fighters in South Africa. IBM computers, we're taking companies in Germany, UK, other countries in Europe and the USA. And so far the cases are going in the slow process through the courts in America so that we can get some justice for the victims. So that's our story, as brief as I can make it. I just want to say, to underline in conclusion, this was a political compromise in view of getting the political negotiations to an end and the possibility of our first democratic elections in 1994. Through civil society pressure, which is very important for you to realize, we got the amnesty law changed and made into a much wider truth commission process and law, which allowed for the stories of the victims to be told, to be recorded forever, which allowed some additional facts and truth to come out through the amnesty process, but not all the truth. We still haven't found all the bodies. We still don't know where some of the bodies were. We still don't know the truth about the bodies that were thrown into the rivers for the crocodiles to eat. Families still will never find out the facts. And therefore it's so utterly important that the issue of reparations in terms of restoring justice to the victims is not allowed to fail as it has done in South Africa, that the victims continue to be supported by a whole range of civil society activists, human rights lawyers, people who will act on their behalf and keep their cause alive. And the church is utterly important to this as well, the faith community. So I hope my story has in some ways supported what you are striving for. And I just want to say, I totally believe and support you in your objectives, and I hope I can come back in the future some way to be part of realizing your dreams, your vision, and the future of this interregional issue, which is so important for the future peace, sustainable peace, and the future prosperity of all the peoples of these different countries. It has to be based on the objectives that you have so clearly delineated, explained to me through what has gone on before. I wish you well, and I will pray for the success of this great initiative in which you are all engaged in so many different ways with all your gifts and skills. Thank you.
Hvala biskupe, što ste podijelili s nama i vašu osobnu priču i zaista svjedočili ono što kažete, posvećenosti, compassion. Mi ćemo sada napraviti pauzu od 15-20 minuta i da nam se ovo slegne i da se onda vratimo i da nam se onda i vi biskupe vratite odmah nazad, da možemo zajedno govoriti o onim pitanjima koje se nas tiču. Zašto ta komisija sada, nakon 15 godina, kako komisija, što želimo, to je prostor u kojem pitanja o kojima ćemo razgovarati nakon pauze. Hvala i vidimo se za